Thanks, Nigel. How's everyone doing? Are we good? Ready for a bit of a stretch? Yeah? It wouldn't be a safety lawyer if I didn't suggest a bit of a stretch. Now, I've been asked to give you a legal perspective on EO safety management today, and in doing that, the focus of my remarks will be in the context of the obligations placed on defence, senior leaders and other members of personnel arising from the Work Health and Safety Act 2011 as these obligations apply to the management of EO. And if I can share with you the central message from my remarks nice and early, so you know where I'm coming from before I get going into the detail. Adopting a proactive risk management approach throughout the capability life cycle of EO is absolutely critical for WHS legal compliance for Defence as an organisation and for the individuals who support EO management, whether that be in a role as leaders, as executive authorities, or technical specialists, or others working in fields relating to EO activities. Proactive and mindful WHS risk management is necessary for informed decision making when it comes to the management of EO. And I've been asked to present to you on two key questions today. What are the WHS legal obligations for Defence as an organisation with respect to EO safety management? And what are the WHS legal obligations for those individuals involved in EO management, including executive authorities and technical specialists who provide advice on safe management of EO? And in order to really understand that, we need to get ourselves into the WHS legislative framework as a whole, what CJ Logg referred to this morning as the paradigm of the Whs Act. So I want to explain how the architecture of the Whs Act works from the perspective of the key duties, the key duty holders and the standards. And we've heard some of the concepts being discussed today. So this SFARP idea, what is that? So far as is reasonably practical, and I'm going to get into what that means. And I'm going to get into as well the Whs Act requirements around the proactive risk management approach and what the process requirements are in that regard, because I think it's very important for us to understand the Australian context in that regard. And I'd like to give you some examples from case law, in particular as to how it's applied in the defence context, and some examples from my own experience. So let's get into it. First, let's talk about the architectural framework of the Whs Act itself from the perspective of the key duty holders. Really, what the purpose of the WHS legislative framework is establishing that proactive risk management approach to achieve safe outcomes. And it does this by making sure that there are obligations placed on all relevant duty holders who may have an impact and ability to influence how safety is achieved and how work is actually performed. So it does that by setting up a duty placed on organisations as systemically what can influence the systems that would be in place for health and safety. So there's this concept of a person conducting a business or undertaking, a PCBU, and what that is the organisational level of compliance on the Commonwealth of Australia, and in this context, the Department of Defence. And the primary duty on Defence is to ensure the health and safety, so far as reasonably practicable, of workers and making sure also that other persons are not put at risk as a result of the course of our undertakings. There are specific components required as part of meeting that primary duty of care, and I'm going to explain those in a moment. And the primary duty is qualified by that standard of reasonable practicability. And I know we've got a lot of discussion around that concept, so I really want to set that out for you. So that's the primary duty of the organisation as the key aspect, key duty holder who has the ability to impact how safe outcomes are achieved in a working environment, right? So we've got PCBU, organisational context first. Who after an organisational level next has the biggest capacity to influence safety cultures, safety outcomes? Anyone want to have a guess? Manager. Senior leaders, right? Yeah, which is, I think, what you mean, right? Yeah, senior leadership. Senior leadership has enormous impact on what goes on. We saw in the Nimrod conversation, you know, what interests our boss fascinates us, that kind of concept coming out. So you've got an officer obligation under the Whs Act for officers to exercise due diligence, taking reasonable steps in exercising due diligence. And I'll come back to that in a moment. a duty on them. So who are officers? Our officers are persons who make or participate in making decisions that affect the whole or a substantial part of an undertaking of the Commonwealth. And in the defence context, that absolutely includes the Secretary and group heads and service chiefs. And I'll come back to due diligence a bit later. So after you've got the senior leadership, after you've got the organisational level, you've now got to deal with everybody else, right? So you've got workers and then you've got other persons. Now, workers include supervisors and middle management, and that includes workers on a depot floor, on the deck plates, whether that be APS personnel or ADF personnel, and indeed also our contractors and subcontractors. All of those are included as workers for the purposes of the duties under the Whs Act. And workers have a specific duty placed on them to take reasonable care for their own health and safety and also ensure that their own acts or emissions don't adversely affect the health and safety of others. They also need to comply with reasonable instructions, policy and procedure put out by organisations for which they work. So I want to explore the notion of reasonable care when we get to talking about worker duties a bit later. Now, failing to meet these duties, that's essentially the framework in a nutshell, the key duties under the Whs Act. Failing to meet those are criminal offences, and in the most serious types of offences where you've got recklessness as to the risk of serious injury or risk of death, Category 1 offence, you've got maximum penalty of $3 million for defence as an organisation, and you've got a maximum penalty of $600,000 and or 5 years imprisonment for officers in failing to meet the officer due diligence obligation, and a maximum penalty of $300,000 and or 5 years imprisonment for workers and other persons who fail to meet that duty in a Category 1 type context. Important to note that most of the cases that have gone through the courts to date have been Category 2 prosecutions, but there are some Category 1 prosecutions currently on foot around the country. But that gives you a sense of the architecture of the legislation. So let's just delve into the detail a bit more now. Let's have a look at the defence duty first. So that duty to ensure health and safety of workers and others so far as is reasonably practicable. As part of fulfilling that primary duty, Defence is required to provide and maintain a work environment without risk to health and safety, provide safe plant and structures, and provide and maintain safe systems of work. There's also a requirement to provide such information, instruction and supervision as is necessary for protecting health and safety arising in the course of the work. So how Defence practically discharges that primary duty of care is by adopting a proactive risk management approach throughout its activities, including in the management of EO throughout the life cycle, whether it be in defining the EO requirements prior to acquisition, developing and acquiring EO through to its warehousing and distribution operations, including stock maintenance and national logistics in terms of support of in-theatre requirements, as well as sustainment management in terms of any upgrades or applying lifing policy, for instance, all the way through to end use, whether that be disposal or use in theatre. Now, Section 17 of the Whs Act makes it very clear that we need to look at the duties in light of a risk management requirement. So a requirement to eliminate risks so far as is reasonably practicable, and if it's not reasonably practicable to eliminate the risks, then moving to minimisation approaches so far as reasonably practicable. Now, we all know that activities involving EO are inherently dangerous. By their very nature and design, EO items are intended to inflict damage on our enemies. But we don't want to harm our own capability, whether that be our personnel or materiel, or have detrimental impacts on civilians in the community at large because of failures in our approach to the management of EO. So we need to think about how the hazards might cause harm throughout the capability life cycle so that EO only has that kind of detrimental impact at the times when that is our actual intent. Now, there's often a misconception that the Whs Act and its requirements get in the way of doing hazardous activities. It's this idea that WHS laws are the equivalent to the stop police when it comes to this area. And it's simply not the case. It's a misunderstanding of how these laws apply. Rather, the WHS laws are simply requiring us to proactively engage with the hazards in our work, effectively plan that work, and put in place the controls to manage the risks given the operational context we face. In that sense, the risk management requirements under the laws really empower us and enable us to engage with that operational environment rather than hinder those operations. It's about effective planning of the work. Now, the WHS regulations go on to explain the specific approach to WHS risk management that's required. There is a prescribed approach, and it's really important for us to understand that context. If any section junkies in legislation amongst us? No? Just me? All right, if you're interested, well, we were talking about the cocaine addiction of the process before. I thought I'd continue the analogy. So in the WHS regulations, it's clauses 34 through 38 for those of you who do want to go and have a look at the source material. We've been talking about the importance of source material. But I want to step you through the steps of the prescribed WHS risk management approach because I think it's really important to us. So step one, we need to identify the hazards. We have to find out what could cause harm. And there is a specific definition of a hazard for the purposes of the WHS laws. And that definition is as follows. It means a situation or thing that has the potential to harm a person. So we've got to think about the things, and we've also got to think about situations. And we're very good at thinking about the things and, you know, the hazards we can actually see, the tangible, less so the situations in my experience. So if we're thinking about EO, the EO item itself is a hazard, yeah? Under that definition, we all agree with that? Yeah? What else is a hazard in that context? It might be the way the EO-related activities are performed, involving other types of hazards. So we may be dealing with moving plant and equipment and working at heights, or dealing with repetitive manual tasks when handling and managing the storage of EO, for instance, or dealing with an in-theatre environment. We saw some examples of that in the previous presentation. The way the work activities themselves are designed, such as crew management or shift work, or the design of storage facilities and logistics management systems, may also create some of those situational hazards. We need to think about how the people are going to interact with the EO in the design of the work activities throughout the life cycle and not just think about the EO item itself. We need to understand the way hazards might arise through the interaction between those hazards as well. And if we think about the Nimrod example, that we saw a bit of an evidence of two different systems and the interaction between those creating the hazard that gave rise to the risk and ultimately the tragic incident, yeah? So the interaction between systems is a really important point in the identification of hazards as well. Thinking about those enablers, those FIC elements, and how hazards might arise in that context too. So essentially we need to be mindful in thinking about the hazards involved in EO management throughout that life cycle. So after identifying hazards, what's next in the process? We need to identify and assess the risks. So understand the nature of the harm that could be caused by the hazard and how serious it could be and the likelihood of it happening. So in the WHS context, a risk is defined as the possibility that harm, death, injury or illness might occur when exposed to a hazard, and it requires us to understand and articulate how that risk might come about. And we need to identify and articulate hazards and risks in order that we can get to the effective control measures to make sure that we've got a system in place that achieves that SFARP standard that we're talking about, right? So in controlling risk, which is our next step, we need to implement the hierarchy of controls. And I know we've got a lot of technical experts here, so you're very familiar as engineers with the hierarchy of controls, but please bear with me. I am going to go through it and give a couple of examples of things from my own experience in defence that might be worth talking about. So quick recap. You've always got to consider the elimination of hazards and risks before you can move on to the minimisation controls in the hierarchy of controls. I do think in defence we often skip past the elimination potential pretty quickly and more quickly than we probably should, because we're often thinking, well, we've got to crack on and do this activity, so we can't eliminate the hazard. Now that might be true, but we potentially can eliminate some of the risks associated with that hazard, right? By really thinking a bit more about it. So don't go just skipping straight over and assuming we can't do anything about it. Just to give you some thoughts about that. You might not be able to eliminate the hazard of EO itself, but you might be able to eliminate a risk associated with lifing issues in warehouse logistics by creating additional systems that remind you when lifing limits are coming up, whether it be 12 months out, 9 months out, 6 months out, so that you can then deal with the expiry and expiration dates, and have enough time to do the effective planning of work in that context. As an example, you might be continuing it on, you might be deciding you do have to dispose of it, but you've got enough time to really think about your options there. So eliminating some risks. While you're not eliminating the hazard, you're eliminating some aspects of the risk by having better systems around logistics, just as an example. Now, only after you think about elimination do you then move through minimisation. And you've firstly got to consider substitution, then isolation, then implementing engineering controls, and only then getting to your administrative controls or providing PPE or implementing a combination of those controls. Now, we're in a far better position to consider designing out hazards and risks before we bring the new capability into service. I know I'm preaching probably to the choir on this context as well. And carrying out effective risk assessments in a planned and considered way really helps us to identify those opportunities. And I wanted to mention one of my own experiences in doing some work with Navy. Got on an FFG, do some ammunitioning down Jervis Bay. I was part of the chain gang. I said I want to be part of activities. I want to get a sense of what life is really like. And one of the things that I got to see was some of the impacts and results down the line in the life cycle of a change in calibre of gun for the particular vessel I was on. So we have a change of the calibre of the gun. So we've got bullets that are larger than the original gun calibre, 40 kilos per bullet. And we've got a hydraulic lift from the original size bullets and the original gun calibre, and we don't have a hydraulic lift for the heavier bullets. Now, if we think about a life cycle approach, should we just do config change around the calibre of the gun? Or should we think about, well, what are the flow-on effects for how people are going to have to be managing things going forward? Because we've got a world of manual handling issues and working at height issues and people being strapped into ladders, going through different levels to get down to the magazine because we don't have that hydraulic lift for the enablers around that config change. So it's that kind of thing that I want to see us get better about in implementing those controls in the broader sense around just that specific issue that we're looking at. Think about how it's going to apply for people's activities and hazards and risks throughout the life cycle of working with that piece. So that's just one example. So I've talked about the hierarchy of controls. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Now, the final step in the WHS legally required risk management process is once you've got those controls in place, actually making sure that they are effective and remain effective over time by reviewing and revising them as necessary. So there's that need to keep it under review. Now, it's a good juncture to talk about what is this reasonable practicability test, yeah? We've talked about risk management, we get WHS risk management, now reasonable practicability. So what is reasonably practicable? What does it mean? And it's actually defined in a section, it's section 18 of the Whs Act, as a weighing up process that you've got to go through. It's about looking at that which is or was at a particular time reasonably able to be done in relation to ensuring health and safety, taking into account and weighing up all relevant matters, including those things that are reasonably practicable on the one hand, with the things that aren't reasonably practicable on the other. So when it comes to looking at what is reasonably practicable, it's looking at the likelihood of the hazard or risk concerned occurring, the degree of harm that might result from the hazard or the risk, and what the person concerned knows or ought reasonably to know about the hazard or the risk, and the ways of eliminating or minimising the risk, and weighing up those things against the availability and suitability of those ways of eliminating or minimising the risk, and then and only then assessing the extent of the risk and the available ways of eliminating or minimising the risk, looking at the cost associated with the available ways of eliminating or minimising the risk, including whether the cost is grossly disproportionate to the risk. So you can only think about cost last. It's legally prescribed that you can only think about cost last, right? Now, if you think about all of those factors that I mentioned in the weighing up process and reasonable practicability, what does it sound like to you? Is it really familiar? Think about the risk management process we just went through. Isn't it essentially requiring you to go through the process of thinking about that risk management approach? isn't it requiring us to put that safety argument together, looking at the hazards, looking at the risks in the work, understanding our context, and then understanding the relevant controls in accordance with the hierarchy? It's as simple as that, as simple and as difficult as that, right? Now, I wanted to mention a couple of things from a legal perspective. You know, I am a lawyer, and please forgive me for that. But a couple of things on an understanding of reasonable practicability. And in fact, the Nimrod example that we had today really made this point. You're only going to be judged on whether some particular control measure was reasonably practicable or not with the benefit of hindsight, when something has gone wrong. I see people nodding their heads in agreement. With the benefit of hindsight, when things have gone wrong. And in fact, something has been found by an investigation report to have been reasonably practicable for us to implement prior to. And even when we don't say it's reasonably practicable prior to, we in defence have a habit, once we get to a courtroom, of doing a 180 and saying actually it was reasonably practicable. And I want to give you a bit of a case example here. So there's a particular prosecution involving defence in the context of the predecessor Whs Act in relation to an incident where there was a serious injury to an officer cadet Minchin, in an ABFA exercise involving a rigid hull inflatable boat doing a fast boat run at ABFA, right? Now, in this particular case, essentially the injuries occur because there isn't a prop guard on the motor of the rib, yeah? He ends up in the drink when he goes over the side while it's going pretty fast, yeah? Now, there had been 6 prior incidents involving ribs and serious injuries arising from failures to have prop guards on outboard motors, on ribs, prior to this particular incident. A number of them had been in Army, a number of them had been in ABFA. And after about the 3rd case, Army decided that it was going to do a safety case study and asked then DMO to do a safety case study to determine whether it was reasonably practicable to put prop guards on the outboard motors. What do you think the safety case study concluded? Yes, reasonably practicable, or no? Okay, hands up who says yes. All right, hands up who says no. No people, you're right, there were less no people. In the safety case study, DMO comes back with the answer that no, it's not reasonably practicable to put prop guards on the outboard motors. Why? Why did they say that? So I hear people saying cost. I hear some people saying cost, and I hear someone else saying operational performance. Yeah, it affects operational performance. Yes, essentially it wasn't cost. Cost did not come up. It was this question of operational performance. We're defence, we're special and unique and different, and we need to have the capability to work these ribs at speed, and therefore we can't have the parameters put around them of having the prop guards. Now, and that was particularly in relation to special forces activities, right? Now, that might be right. But what happened when we got to our 7th incident and we hadn't implemented those controls and we get to court and we're being told that we haven't done what's reasonably practicable in those circumstances? Did we change our mind? Did we say it was reasonably practicable to put prop guards on? Okay, hands up if you think we said yes, or yep. And who thinks we said no? All right, half. You're less certain this time. We changed our mind. We said, yes, it was reasonably practicable to put the prop guards on. Now, I actually think the answer is kind of in between, because we are able to look at operational context and consider operational context in deciding what are reasonably practicable measures to implement for a particular issue, right? So it might be reasonably practicable for us to put on prop guards in the context of an AVFA training exercise. In fact, it absolutely will be. For special forces exercises where we need the ability to go fast in operational contexts, might not be reasonably practicable to put on for that particular context. What about something in between? What about other operational contexts? Should we have the prop guards on or not? You tell me. I hear some yes? It depends on context, right? what do we actually want to do? We've got to start with that question. What are we doing? And what are the right control measures to bring to bear in that context? With those hazards and risks, understanding who are the people, what is the environment, what are we dealing with? And one of the things that's worth mentioning is that we do actually get in trouble quite a lot when it comes to training. And if you look at the prosecutions that we've had in defence, it's training context that gets us in trouble quite a lot of the time. Training context, people are more vulnerable because they're still learning, right? So we've got to bring more controls to bear in that kind of context. And I wanted to mention the Trooper Lawrence heat stroke death is an example of that, and also the particular incident involving the Coltana training area. Are people familiar with this case? The death of Lance Corporal Edwards in a live firing case at the Coltana training area. And it's worth mentioning because I think it brings together these ideas of what is reasonably practicable and risk management. I did want to mention it in case anyone who was involved and might find it traumatic to hear the issues going as I talk through. This particular incident occurred in October 2009, and it was in the continuation training, in the final collective training for mission-specific training for Afghanistan deployments in 2010. And this particular training was the final kind of workups in October 2009. So there'd been a bunch of other training that had led to getting combat ready for compound attacks involving live firing. So it didn't go straight to live firing, we kind of worked up to that in this particular training environment. So there's a prosecution in relation to this incident in August 2015. It's under the old health and safety laws, but the same duty and same standards apply. So it's useful for our purposes. So you've got this October 2009 training going on. Now, this particular training, there were day exercises, night exercises involving live firing. There was one risk management plan put together for both the day and night exercises. Sort of the training exercises together were being dealt with as part of one risk management plan and risk assessment. And you had an officer in charge of practice being put in charge, putting together safety briefs, setting up, making sure that there were safety supervisors for the work. You had briefs before the day training exercises, briefs before the night exercises. And you had one particular platoon, multiple teams, essentially doing compound attacks, and there were changes between the different types of people who were set up as safety supervisors between day and night exercises. And there are requirements around who needed to be safety supervisors, so qualification requirements, for instance, in that context. Now, the officer in charge had put particular people on the role of safety supervisor. Someone else came along and thought, hang on a minute, that bloke over there, he doesn't actually have the qualifications required to be a safety supervisor. He changes the safety supervisor out between briefing times and says to the new safety supervisor, you've got to go and get a briefing to make sure that you understand where the teams are going to be in this compound attack and understand the hazards, risks and the entire plan for the attack. Now, there were a bunch of miscommunications and failures in making sure that actually took place. And particular teams were told to go behind particular structures, and the structures used in the training exercises were made from Besser block. Right? So you had a team that was going to be behind the western wall, and there were meant to be two teams kind of stacked together behind another wall. Now, Team 1 didn't understand that Team 2 was going to be in a particular location. Team 2 thought, and their safety supervisor thought that they could choose from two particular locations to be in rather than the specific location that the officer in charge of practice had suggested. So total miscommunication about where people were going to be. So charges were on the walls. One particular team starts live firing through the Besser block wall, doesn't realise that one of the other teams is directly behind those targets and is live firing into their fellow colleagues. couldn't see them behind the Besser block wall. So a bunch of communication failures, a bunch of supervision failures around that. And the case talks quite a lot to those failures. It also talks about the range manual and the deficiencies from the safe system of work perspective. So failures to have assurance processes to ensure that the procedures were actually being implemented, really important aspect of ensuring a safe system will work. Also, the failure to have specific risk assessments for each live firing serial and the particular context and understanding the different context between day and night activities, a really critical failure. And the individuals falling short in relation to miscommunications and the last-minute safety briefings, etc. So quite a lot of systemic issues there. Now, those were under a lot of conversation in the prosecution, and we pleaded guilty and were found to have breached the then legislation and received a penalty of $220,000 from what was then the maximum $242,000. But I've got a bigger issue with the risk management approach and failures to have reasonably practical steps and controls in place here from that description I've given you. Anyone want to have a guess what it is? Because if you think about a lot of those controls I've just described, it was about failures in supervision, failures in instruction and those issues, and they're admin controls. Is there something higher up the order of controls that ought to have been thought about and dealt with in those specific risk assessments? Blocks. Well, it had come to the point where they'd worked up to live ammunition. So I think, yes, they do need to use live ammunition. I'm not suggesting they didn't need to train for live ammunition. I think absolutely you need to train for that. And they had got to that point. So I don't have a problem with that. But someone said the blocks. Someone said Besser blocks. Yeah. And we'd failed to understand that we were doing something different in that training area to what we might have been doing in the past with that particular location. So it's that question about the safety of the location for the particular purpose and the context that we are using it for, yeah? And thinking about the fundamental assumptions. Because we've just been doing risk assessment after risk assessment. We've always been doing this and dealing with it on that local level, at the exercise level, rather than thinking upstream and whether we've got a serious change here that we've got to be dealing with. And if we'd thought about that, if we thought about the capacity for live firing into a Besser block wall being able to penetrate, we would have designed that out some way, right? How might we design that out?
Get a structural engineering first ones.
Yeah.
And you work out the probability of failure for a particular terminology effect.
Yeah.
And it comes back to what's the acceptance? What's the risk acceptance level?
It comes back to getting that evidence, doesn't it? Firstly, we've got a suggestion down here. Did everyone hear that? Structural integrity, get some reports about what kind of material would be appropriate, do some analysis, build that evidence to determine what are the effective control measures for dealing with that hazard and that risk. But if we're not doing effective planned safety risk assessments in the way required by the laws, we don't even realise that we've made an assumption, right? And we've got to build and bring people together in the collaboration, bringing the various resources and skill sets to bear to work out what those effective controls are, doing that analysis, building that evidence base for our safety risk assessment. So I think it's a very interesting case and one that kind of brings us back to design issues and the need to really think about safety and design of our locations as well as the EO item itself and how those things interact. Worth pointing out that there are overlapping duties between Defence and other organisations in this context, so our contractors also have the same obligations where they're in the mix of EO activities, and there's a need to collaborate with them as well. And in fact, we have an obligation under the WHS laws to do that collaboration. And it was really great to see in the previous the presentation that collaboration discussion between the various people who were stakeholders in the mix, because that's a really important part of doing a proactive approach to safety risk management. So if Defence is to manage its Whs Act legal liability in relation to the management of EO, it really needs to avoid those similar risk management failures, and it does so by being proactive on that risk management approach throughout the life cycle. And that approach also means that defence is more likely to actually achieve safe outcomes. It's not just about legal compliance, right? In fact, that's a happy byproduct of adopting this approach that I've laid out. How are we going for time? Are we good? Are we over? All right, fantastic. Officer due diligence. There are 6 elements to due diligence. In order for our leaders to be in a position to have informed decision making, workers really need to be helping them by putting together the appropriate safety arguments. And when you look at what is required in reasonable care for workers, it really requires you to look at your role, your responsibilities, your skills, and your expertise. The worker duty exists on a continuum in that particular context. So the greater your responsibilities, the greater the duty expected of you under the worker duty of care. So a person operating as an executive authority responsible for a specific EO activity, they're going to have a greater duty than a supervisor in an EO warehouse or a supervisor of a unit who's going to have a greater duty than the line worker on the depot floor, for instance. So you've got to really think about where your roles, responsibilities and accountabilities fit in. When you've got technical expertise that's relied upon by others, for instance in the EO space, you're similarly required to exercise a greater degree of care in relation to applying what is that reasonable standard given your expertise. So it's not sufficient for us as technical specialists to say, look, this system's been accepted elsewhere, therefore we can just crack on accepting the stuff that we're being given here and the data that we're being given. As someone in the audience said this morning, and in fact I think we've had an echoing theme of it throughout today, you've got to subject the information you receive to scrutiny, ask questions. You've got to understand the assumptions that underpin the analysis that you're being given, and work out whether those assumptions hold up in our particular operating context. Do we need to do additional work given the context, whether it be the WHS risk management context that I've just outlined or the context of the operating environment that we're going to face? Do we have appropriate assurance regimes in place for ensuring those controls are actually going to be implemented in that safety case throughout the life cycle? And are we putting the responsibilities and accountabilities on people as part of that safety argument? One of the things that I often hear is that, look, it's all very difficult for us because, we operate in a MOTS environment, we're under a lot of time pressure, there are a lot of resource constraints, and all of this is making it really, really difficult. And people kind of have a learned helplessness, in my experience, in dealing with that. It's like, well, it's all too hard, and we walk away. For us to be doing what is reasonably practicable, we have to be asking those questions. We have to at least attempt to get that information, to attempt to get that evidence, do our own analysis. That's what's reasonably practicable, particularly in this upstream engineering context that we're often dealing with here. That is what is considered reasonably practicable for the purpose of legislation. Now, let's say you can't get that information in the context of the constraints that you are dealing with, whether it be a time pressure for commissioning or acquisition into service that is a government pressure that's put on you and there's nothing you can do about it. If you are a worker who's a technical specialist that's putting together those safety arguments, it is absolutely critical that you're explaining those limitations, that you're explaining that that's the context you're dealing with, that you outline where the evidence gaps are. And we're not just silent about them, we're not just eating the risk like we eat it for breakfast, right? Thinking, let's just hope everything's okay. Why is that important? Anyone want to have a guess why I think that's really critical for us to be putting into our safety arguments? Yes, exactly. It's for informed decision making. Our leaders need that from us. If they're going to be in a position to meet the 6 elements of the due diligence obligation, they need that information. They don't want you to be hiding the truth from them. They need an accurate picture as the hazards and risks and the ways in which we don't have appropriate resources and processes in place, because those are elements of their due diligence obligation, right? And then that can inform their further conversations at a strategic level so that they can work out, well, do we need to do something different about the operating context? Do we need to do something different about how we actually pull things together? Do we need to talk more to government? And if there's a lesson from the Home Installation Scheme Inquiry Report, it is tell truth to power. And I know you might call me naive for making these points, but it's absolutely critical for those leaders to be in the right position for their officer personal due diligence. I'm sure I've taken up more than my time, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.